Under the vast blue sky of a cool, crisp afternoon, the luxury flight of Aurora Sky Airlines is taking off, carrying with it the promise of elegance and impeccable service. Renowned for its top-tier standards and catering to an elite clientele, Aurora Sky Airlines is celebrated for providing an exceptional travel experience. Today, Flight AS237 is poised to exceed its passengers' high expectations. Inside the first-class cabin, the spacious interior is adorned with sophisticated decor featuring warm, muted color tones and gentle lighting that creates an ambiance both inviting and modern. Every detail exudes opulence, from the smooth leather seats to the meticulously arranged tables and chairs, forming a living portrait of refinement and class. Amid this luxurious setting, Zara Carter, a dignified, confident, and graceful black woman, steps into the cabin with a calm poise that radiates elegance in every gesture. Her natural curls are neatly styled, framing a face that beams with intelligence and self-assurance. Zara not only captures the attention of those around her with her striking appearance, but she also commands respect with a powerful presence, as if she were already well acquainted with the upper echelons of society. Meanwhile, echoing from the corridors of the first-class cabin, the soft footsteps of Emily, a flight attendant with a cold, haughty demeanor, can be heard. Dressed impeccably in her uniform, Emily's sharp features and calculating eyes betray an arrogance bordering on disdain for the passengers she deems unsuitable for the elite. Although her service is designed to be professional, her icy glances and curt remarks gradually reveal an underlying attitude of contempt and prejudice, a forewarning of the trouble that is soon to come. Within the cabin, the initially warm and sophisticated atmosphere begins to give way to an undercurrent of tension as curious eyes fixate on Zara. Her presence not only highlights an exceptional individual amidst the crowd, but also serves as a powerful affirmation of the dignity and rights of a black woman in a world where bias still lingers. This moment marks the beginning of a series of dramatic events, where pride and deep-seated prejudice will be exposed, ensuring that the fate of every person on this flight will be forever changed. As the aircraft's boarding call echoed through the terminal, a sense of anticipation mixed with subdued tension rippled through the first-class cabin. Passengers began to stream into the luxurious space, each step echoing against the polished surfaces and soft, ambient lighting. Among them, Zara Carter moved with an air of quiet dignity, her gaze steady and her movements deliberate. Though she had already captured many admiring glances from earlier, her presence now deepened the mix of curiosity and unspoken judgment within the cabin. At the entrance of the first-class cabin, a few well-dressed passengers exchanged polite smiles and murmurs of approval as they recognized Zara's unmistakable poise. However, not everyone's reaction was warm. In one corner, a group of business travelers whispered among themselves, their voices laced with a subtle tone of superiority that hinted at an unyielding bias. Their eyes, glancing furtively at Zara, betrayed a skepticism that simmered beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Emily, the flight attendant with the cold, imperious air, stood near the entrance with her arms neatly folded, observing each passenger as they took their seats. Her eyes briefly scanned Zara, lingering just a moment longer than necessary, and then shifted to a clipboard as she prepared for the next step in the boarding process. Emily's posture was rigid, every motion calculated to maintain an aura of authority, yet beneath that veneer lay a palpable disdain that few could miss. As Zara gracefully navigated her way to her assigned seat in the first-class section, another flight attendant approached her with a courteous smile. "Good afternoon, Ms. Carter. Welcome aboard," the attendant said warmly, offering assistance with Zara's carry-on bag. Zara responded with a gentle nod and a polite smile, her calm demeanor reflecting both grace and an inner strength honed by years of experience in challenging environments. Despite these courteous interactions, the atmosphere remained tinged with undercurrents of tension. Several passengers, noticing the discreet exchange between Zara and the attendant, began to exchange knowing looks. One older gentleman, seated by the window, murmured under his breath about how unusual it was to see someone like Zara in such an exclusive setting. His comment, though soft, resonated with a lingering prejudice that colored the perceptions of those nearby. Emily, however, maintained her icy professionalism as she made her way along the aisle. Her steps were brisk and her eyes, sharp and assessing, dropped brief, calculating glances at each passenger's ticket before moving on. When she reached Zara's row, a slight furrow of disapproval crossed her features, though it was quickly masked by a curt nod. "Please take your seat," she said in a tone that left little room for interpretation. There was an unmistakable edge to her voice, one that suggested Zara's presence was not entirely welcome. Zara, ever composed, slid into her seat with a measured grace. As she settled in, she couldn't help but notice the way some fellow passengers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their eyes darting between her and Emily. It was as if the very act of her boarding had disrupted an unspoken social order. In the quiet moments that followed, Zara's thoughts turned inward. She silently noted every detail: the dismissive tone in Emily's voice, the furtive glances of envy and disdain, and even the subtle nods of support from those few who recognized the injustice at play. Across the cabin, the interplay of subtle interactions continued to build an undercurrent of drama. One young businesswoman seated a few rows ahead shot Zara an encouraging smile as if to silently convey, "I see you." Meanwhile, a stern-looking gentleman in a tailored suit, his expression unreadable, kept his gaze fixed on his phone, perhaps trying to ignore the unfolding dynamics. The boarding process, which for many would be a mere formality, was now charged with a tension that hinted at the dramatic events to come. Every interaction, every glance exchanged in the confines of that luxurious cabin served as a prelude to an inevitable confrontation of ideals, a clash between deep-seated prejudice and the quiet power of dignity. As the final passengers took their seats, the cabin settled into a deceptive calm, with the promise of escalating conflict simmering just beneath the surface. In that charged atmosphere, Zara's quiet strength and unyielding grace began to assert themselves not only as a personal shield, but as a silent declaration that no amount of haughty disdain or prejudiced judgment could ever diminish the inherent worth and dignity of a person. This initial encounter set the stage for a journey where every gesture and every word would carry the weight of a broader struggle, one that was poised to challenge the very foundations of elitism and bias within the world of high society. The deceptive calm of the first-class cabin shattered abruptly when Emily, the flight attendant with the frosty glare, approached Zara's row. As the cabin settled into a brief lull after boarding, Emily's steps quickened. Her uniform, crisply ironed and adorned with polished insignia, seemed to amplify the sternness etched on her face. With a clipboard clutched in one hand, she stopped right beside Zara's seat, her eyes narrowing as if she had discovered a hidden flaw. "Excuse me, Miss Carter," Emily said, her voice measured yet edged with an unmistakable coldness. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Zara's eyes met Emily's with an unruffled calm. For a moment, time seemed to stretch as the two women locked gazes. A silent duel of dignity versus disdain. Zara, known for her grace under pressure, produced her boarding pass with a steady hand. The paper, pristine and official, bore all the markings of a legitimate first-class ticket. Yet the mere act of presenting it seemed to trigger something in Emily. She scanned the boarding pass slowly, her eyes darting back and forth over the details. A faint, almost imperceptible frown creased her brow. "This is for first class," Zara confirmed softly, maintaining her composure despite the tension in the air. Emily's eyes, however, betrayed her inner conflict. "Yes, first class," she repeated, the words dripping with a mixture of incredulity and contempt. "But I'm afraid there's been a mistake." Her tone was icy, as though the very notion of Zara occupying that seat was an affront to some unspoken rule. A murmur of discontent seemed to ripple among nearby passengers. Whispers and sideways glances filled the space between rows as if the cabin itself were holding its breath, waiting for the drama to unfold. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably while others exchanged knowing looks, a silent commentary on the unfolding confrontation. Zara's heart pounded beneath her calm exterior, yet her expression remained unreadable. "I don't understand," she said, her voice even and polite. My ticket was booked and confirmed weeks ago. Emily's eyes flickered with barely concealed irritation. I've double-checked, she replied, her tone condescending. I'm not entirely sure that this seat is appropriate for you. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken prejudice. It was not merely a question of a booking error, it was a challenge to Zara's right to belong. The atmosphere grew thicker as other flight attendants, and even a few first-class passengers turned their attention toward the unfolding scene. The tension was palpable. It was as if the cabin had become an arena where social hierarchies and deeply ingrained biases were about to be laid bare. A short silence ensued before Emily continued in a more imperious tone. Miss Carter, I'm going to have to ask you to move to a seat in the main cabin, she stated firmly, her voice rising just enough to leave no doubt that this was a command, not a request. If you do not comply, I'll have no choice but to call security. For a heartbeat, the cabin seemed to hold its collective breath. Zara's eyes glistened with a quiet, steady fire. Despite the insult and the attempt to undermine her dignity, she did not flinch. Instead, she slowly folded the boarding pass and returned it to her purse, her fingers lingering on it as if to reaffirm its undeniable truth. A hushed murmur swept through the cabin as Zara rose from her seat. Her movements were measured and deliberate, and though the gesture of leaving her first-class seat was forced upon her, there was a dignified resignation in the way she carried herself. She glanced briefly at the passengers nearby, those who had looked on in silent sympathy and those whose eyes burned with silent judgment, and then began to collect her personal belongings. Emily watched with a mixture of self-satisfaction and simmering unease. Her posture remained stiff, but internally the situation was far from under control. The air had already shifted from one of opulent calm to a charged battleground where pride and prejudice clashed. As Zara moved toward the exit of the first-class cabin, the soft hum of the aircraft's engines seemed to punctuate every step she took. The murmurs of the onlookers grew louder, some expressing shock, others nodding subtly in approval. A young man in a designer suit leaned over to a companion and murmured, "It's outrageous! She deserves her place here." In stark contrast, a middle-aged gentleman whispered, "I've never seen such behavior on a flight like this." Zara reached the threshold of the first-class cabin and paused briefly at the aisle. The corridor beyond beckoned with its promise of the more modest accommodations of the main cabin, yet she stood tall, her back straight and her gaze unyielding. In that charged moment, she silently vowed that this indignity would not be the end of her story. There was something deliberate about the way Emily had chosen to challenge her, something that hinted at a deeper bias, a prejudice not easily erased by mere boarding passes and seat numbers. Back in first class, Emily's face flushed with a mix of triumph and trepidation. She had executed her task, yet the nagging feeling that she had crossed a line persisted. It was as if the very air in the cabin had turned against her, and her carefully constructed authority began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny and internal guilt. As Zara walked down the aisle, escorted by another flight attendant whose eyes mirrored both pity and concern, the incident took on an almost surreal quality. The elegant, meticulously designed interior of the plane now felt like a stage set for a drama far greater than a simple boarding error. Every detail, the crisp white linens, the subdued lighting, even the faint scent of expensive perfume, seemed to underscore the gravity of what was happening. Once in the main cabin, Zara's calm facade did not waver. In fact, as she settled into a less comfortable seat, she retrieved her smartphone and a small notepad from her bag. With deliberate precision, she began to document the encounter, each remark, every glance, and even recorded a short video. This was not an act of impulsive retaliation. It was a calculated move to preserve evidence of an injustice that went far beyond a simple seating mix-up. The rest of the flight passed in a subdued manner, but the impact of that ticket verification moment lingered like an electric charge. In the cockpit, the captain glanced at the cabin cameras with a raised eyebrow, perhaps sensing that the atmosphere below was more volatile than usual. In the main cabin, Zara's quiet determination stood in stark contrast to the palpable discomfort felt by many of her fellow passengers. Back in first class, Emily found herself increasingly isolated. Other flight attendants exchanged uneasy looks, and even the passengers who had once maintained an air of indifferent superiority now seemed to scrutinize her actions with a mix of disapproval and curiosity. The subtle shift in the social dynamics on board was a testament to the fact that such blatant acts of discrimination were no longer going unnoticed. In that brief but intense episode of ticket verification, the true nature of the underlying tensions on this flight was exposed. It was not merely about a mistake in seat allocation, it was about the assertion of power, the abuse of authority, and the deep-rooted prejudices that continue to fester in even the most exclusive environments. As Zara Carter, a woman of impeccable dignity and quiet resolve, endured the indignity with unwavering strength, the seeds of a larger struggle were sown. That moment, charged with raw emotion and unspoken defiance, set the stage for the dramatic events to follow. It signaled the beginning of a confrontation that would not only challenge the established hierarchy on that flight, but would also reverberate far beyond the confines of the aircraft. For Zara, it was a call to action, a promise that she would not allow such an injustice to pass without consequence. And for those watching, it was a powerful reminder that dignity and respect are not privileges to be granted or denied on the basis of appearance or background, but inalienable rights that must be upheld, no matter the cost. The atmosphere inside the aircraft shifted palpably after the tense exchange during ticket verification. With a final steely glare and a curt command, Emily's voice cut through the murmurs of the first-class cabin. "Ms. Carter, please proceed to the main cabin immediately. I'm afraid you cannot remain in first class." The directive was not a request. It was an order, delivered with the icy finality of someone who believed that her authority was beyond reproach. For a moment, the cabin fell into an uncomfortable silence. Every eye in first class was fixed on Zara, whose calm yet resolute expression betrayed no sign of surrender. With a graceful nod that masked the tumult of emotions swirling within her, Zara stood up. Slowly, deliberately, she gathered her personal items from the fold-out table in her seat pocket, each motion measured as if to affirm that no amount of humiliation could shake her dignity. As she stepped into the aisle, a series of whispered remarks and furtive glances swept through the cabin. Some passengers appeared genuinely sympathetic, their eyes soft with pity, while others maintained an air of haughty detachment, as if her departure from first class somehow restored an unspoken social order. Zara's every step was a quiet defiance, a message that she would not allow the cruelty of prejudice to define her. Emily watched Zara's movement with a mixture of satisfaction and growing unease. On one hand, she felt vindicated by her own actions. On the other, the public nature of the incident and the shifting gazes of the elite passengers made her doubt the righteousness of her decision. She hurried to ensure that the transition went smoothly, directing another attendant to clear the way and secure any remaining valuables from Zara's abandoned seat. The corridor between the first-class cabin and the main cabin was narrow, its lighting less refined and its ambiance decidedly more utilitarian. As Zara walked down this passage, every step echoed against the polished metal walls, each sound magnified by the heavy silence. It was as if the very architecture of the plane was complicit in underscoring her fall from grace, a symbolic transition from an elite world to one of more modest means. A few flight attendants, whose faces had remained impassive until now, exchanged brief glances that hinted at their internal conflicts. One of them, a younger attendant with a sympathetic expression, lowered her eyes as if in silent apology. Zara noticed the fleeting moment of human warmth and allowed herself a tiny, grateful smile, even as the sting of humiliation lingered. Upon reaching the main cabin, Zara was greeted by a stark contrast in atmosphere. The seats were arranged in a more cramped, less luxurious fashion, and the overall decor lacked the polished elegance of the first-class section. Yet, there was something equally dignified about this space, a sense of unpretentious reality that spoke to a broader spectrum of life. Zara's gaze swept over the cabin, and she could see that many passengers here bore expressions of both curiosity and concern, their eyes silently conveying solidarity in the face of an injustice that had just unfolded. Still holding her phone and notepad, Zara took a moment to settle into an available seat in the middle section. With practiced precision, she placed her bag under the seat and rejoined the flow of the cabin, her demeanor as composed as ever. Once seated, she discreetly began reviewing the footage she had recorded on her phone earlier, ensuring that every detail of the confrontation was safely preserved. In her mind, this was more than a personal battle. It was a documented stand against the prejudice that had been so brazenly displayed. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder as word of the incident spread. Some whispered in admiration of Zara's quiet strength, while others muttered criticisms that betrayed their own ingrained biases. A man sitting nearby, his tone low and disapproving, remarked to his companion, "It's not right for someone like her to be here in first class anyway." The comment, laced with unspoken contempt, was met by a few disapproving glances from other passengers who knew that dignity was not something that could be denied on the basis of skin color. Meanwhile, back in first class, the fallout of the incident was palpable. Several passengers who had witnessed the confrontation now exchanged glances that conveyed a mixture of shock and disquiet. The luxurious compartment, once a sanctuary of refined comfort, now felt tarnished by the bitter taste of injustice. Emily, still in her authoritative role, tried to maintain order and reassure the remaining first-class passengers, but the undercurrent of tension was unmistakable. There was a lingering question in the air. Had the act of forcibly relocating Zara been an isolated error, or was it symptomatic of a deeper malaise within the service culture? In the main cabin, Zara's thoughts raced as she took in the scene around her. Every detail, the way the overhead bins rattled with the movement of luggage, the murmur of voices blending into a soft cacophony, even the occasional clink of a beverage cup, served as a stark reminder of the abrupt transition from luxury to the commonplace. Yet, in this humble setting, Zara's resolve only grew stronger. She knew that what she had just endured was not merely a mistake in seating arrangement, it was a calculated act of discrimination. The very fact that her valid first-class ticket was dismissed solely on the basis of an unspoken prejudice was an affront not only to her dignity but to the principles of fairness and respect. As the flight continued, the tension in the main cabin was counterbalanced by a growing sense of quiet solidarity among some of the passengers. A young woman sitting 2 rows ahead offered Zara a supportive smile, while a middle-aged man in a faded blazer nodded subtly in acknowledgement. These small gestures, seemingly insignificant in the moment, coalesced into an unspoken message of resistance against the entrenched biases that had been so brazenly displayed. Throughout the remainder of the flight, Zara remained vigilant. Every so often, she would glance around the cabin, observing the varied reactions of those present. Some passengers, once secure in their privileged silence, now wore expressions of reflective concern. Others, however, continued to display indifference, as if unwilling or unable to confront the uncomfortable truth that prejudice could infiltrate even the most elite spheres. For her part, Emily struggled to maintain the veneer of control in first class. The act of ordering Zara's relocation, which she had executed with the confidence of someone convinced of her own righteousness, now loomed over her as a potential source of professional downfall. With each passing minute, the voices of discontent and the weight of scrutiny grew heavier, and the authoritative facade she had so carefully constructed began to crack under the pressure. In a quiet corner of the main cabin, as the flight advanced towards its destination, Zara took a deep breath and began drafting a detailed account of the incident. Every observation, every word spoken, was meticulously recorded in her notepad. This was not a rash decision born out of impulsive anger. Rather, it was a calculated step to ensure that the injustice she had experienced would not be swept under the rug. In her mind, the documentation of this encounter was both a shield and a weapon, an assertion that she would stand against discrimination no matter the cost. The forced relocation had transformed what could have been a fleeting moment of humiliation into a defining episode, a turning point that exposed the raw edges of societal prejudice and the fragility of the structures that upheld it. As the aircraft continued its journey through the boundless sky, the echoes of that pivotal moment resonated far beyond the cramped confines of the cabin. It was a stark reminder that, in the battle between dignity and discrimination, even a single act of defiance could ignite a spark that might one day blaze into widespread change. By the time the flight neared its descent, the incident had left an indelible mark on everyone on board. The luxury of first class had been irrevocably tainted by the injustice meted out to Zara, and the shift to the main cabin, though less opulent, carried with it the unyielding truth of resilience. As Zara stared out the window at the expanse of clouds below, a tapestry of endless possibilities, she felt a quiet determination settle in her heart. This experience, painful as it was, had reaffirmed her belief in the importance of standing up for one's rights and the inherent dignity of every human being. In that defining moment, as the plane prepared to descend and the passengers braced themselves for landing, the memory of the forced relocation would linger like a whispered promise. A promise that injustice would not go unchallenged, and that every act of discrimination, no matter how subtle, was a call to action for those who believed in equality. For Zara Carter, the journey had taken an unexpected turn, but it was a turn that heralded a new beginning. A beginning where her courage and unwavering resolve would serve as a beacon of hope for countless others facing similar battles. Now settled in the main cabin, Zara Carter's inner resolve began to crystallize into a determined, silent rebellion. The transition from the luxurious confines of first class to the modest atmosphere of the main cabin had been both humiliating and jarring. Yet, as she gazed around at the stark, utilitarian surroundings, she felt a surge of determination rising from within. A resolve that this injustice would not be allowed to fade into the background of an indifferent flight. In the quiet moments that followed, while most passengers busied themselves with magazines or their devices, Zara reached into her bag and pulled out her smartphone and a small leather-bound notepad. With deliberate care, she began to document every detail of the incident. The memory of Emily's frosty tone and the haughty, contemptuous glances from some of the nearby passengers were etched into her mind. Zara activated her phone's recording feature, capturing snippets of conversations and the ambient murmur of discontent that filled the cabin. Every whispered remark, every subtle scoff from those who supported the unjust decision was recorded as evidence of an act of discrimination that could not be dismissed as a mere mistake. Her pen moved steadily over the pages of her notepad as she detailed the events. The moment Emily demanded her boarding pass, the dismissive manner in which her legitimate first-class ticket was questioned, and the subsequent order to move to the economy section. Zara's handwriting was neat and methodical, mirroring the calm precision with which she conducted herself despite the emotional turmoil inside. Each line she wrote was a quiet testament to her refusal to be diminished by prejudice. Beyond her personal documentation, Zara felt an urgency to alert those who could help transform this moment of personal injustice into a catalyst for broader change. With measured confidence, she composed a series of discreet messages. First, she contacted a close confidant, a well-respected civil rights attorney who had long been an advocate against discrimination in all its forms. In her message, Zara detailed the events of the flight, emphasizing not only the humiliation she had experienced, but also the systemic implications of such behavior in an establishment that prided itself on excellence and inclusivity. The reply was almost instantaneous, a brief yet supportive message that reassured Zara that her voice would not go unheard. The attorney promised to look into the matter further and hinted at a network of influential figures who had the power to hold the airline accountable. This confirmation bolstered Zara's spirit, reinforcing the notion that her silence was not an acceptance but rather a strategic pause before the storm of change. Around her, the cabin's social dynamics were revealing more than just casual indifference. In one corner, a well-dressed man in a crisp suit leaned toward his companion and muttered, "She really shouldn't be here, in first class or anywhere." His voice, barely audible, carried an unmistakable tone of superiority and prejudice. Nearby, a group of passengers exchanged smirks and disapproving glances, their hushed comments laced with racial bias. Yet, in the midst of these overt displays of contempt, there were subtle signs of solidarity. A young woman a few rows ahead caught Zara's eye and offered a soft, understanding smile, a small gesture that spoke volumes of empathy and support for what Zara was enduring. As the minutes ticked by, the cabin's ambiance shifted imperceptibly. The initial shock and disquiet had given way to a deeper, more contemplative silence among those who had witnessed the unfolding drama. Zara's every movement, from the careful way she arranged her belongings to the deliberate, almost ritualistic manner in which she recorded the incident became a powerful statement of resistance. In that moment, she was not merely a passenger forced to relinquish her rightful place. She had transformed herself into a symbol of dignity and defiance against an age-old system of bias. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, Zara maintained her composure. The discomfort of the cramped seating, the incessant hum of the overhead bins, and the murmurs of disapproval from some quarters did little to deter her. Instead, they steeled her determination to ensure that the incident would be remembered and, more importantly, would serve as a turning point for accountability. Every detail she captured was not just for her own recollection, but for the countless others who might face similar indignities in the future. Meanwhile, the internal conflict among the airline staff was growing more evident. In first class, Emily's confident facade began to crumble under the weight of silent scrutiny. Whispers among her colleagues hinted at doubts about her actions, and a few sympathetic voices, though rare in that environment, began to question the propriety of her conduct. Yet, for now, the spotlight in the main cabin remained on Zara. With every discreet recording and every written note, she built an unassailable case that could not be brushed aside as a mere clerical error. As the flight progressed, Zara's resolve found its rhythm. She took intermittent glances at the faces around her, noting expressions that ranged from indifferent to outright hostile. In one brief moment of reflection, she recalled a time in her past when she had to fight against similar prejudices in a different arena, an experience that had taught her the value of measured resistance and the power of documentation. That memory fueled her now, as she silently vowed that this incident would not pass without igniting a broader conversation about discrimination in spaces where respect and dignity should be paramount. In the midst of her silent rebellion, Zara also noticed subtle shifts in the behavior of some passengers. A couple seated across the aisle exchanged looks that were part dismay, part defiance, as if silently protesting the injustice they had witnessed. Their eyes, meeting hers for a fleeting moment, conveyed a sense of shared understanding, an acknowledgement that the status quo was not immutable, and that one act of quiet courage could ripple outward into a larger movement. As the flight continued its steady course across the sky, Zara's recordings and notes gradually accumulated into a detailed chronicle of the day's events. A narrative that captured not only the facts but also the raw emotions and intricate power dynamics at play. Each piece of evidence was a brick in the foundation of what she hoped would become a case for systemic change. The planned repercussions were clear in her mind. This incident was to be a spark that would illuminate the darker corners of prejudice and prompt a long overdue re-examination of how passengers were treated based solely on their skin color. In the solitude of her seat, Zara allowed herself a moment to breathe deeply. The cool air of the main cabin, though far less luxurious than the first-class ambiance she had been denied, was filled with an electric sense of possibility. It was a reminder that sometimes the most profound acts of resistance occur in silence, carried out not with loud protests but with the steadfast determination of those who refuse to accept injustice as the norm. With each passing minute, the quiet act of recording and note-taking evolved into a declaration of independence. Zara understood that her personal experience was intertwined with a larger, ongoing struggle for equality, a struggle that had been fought in courtrooms, boardrooms, and even on airplanes before her. Now, as she documented every nuance of the incident, she was contributing to a legacy of resistance that challenged entrenched systems of power. The soft hum of the engines and the rhythmic vibrations of the aircraft provided a constant backdrop to her inner monologue. Zara's thoughts were a blend of reflective calm and strategic planning. She mentally rehearsed the conversations she would later have with her contacts, the questions she would raise, and the changes she hoped to see implemented within the airline. This was not a moment of fleeting anger or impulsive outrage. It was a deliberate, thoughtful response. A quiet resistance aimed at exposing and ultimately dismantling the prejudiced practices that had been allowed to persist unchecked. As the journey continued toward its eventual descent, Zara's heart remained resolute. In the quiet rebellion of her actions lay a powerful message: that dignity and respect are not privileges to be arbitrarily granted or revoked, but fundamental rights that must be defended at all costs. Her silent resistance, meticulously documented and born out of a deep personal conviction, was destined to echo far beyond the confines of this flight, serving as both a personal vindication and a call to action for all who believed in justice. In that shared space of discomfort and defiance, Zara Carter emerged not merely as a victim of injustice, but as a beacon of hope and a catalyst for change. A quiet, powerful force poised to challenge the very foundations of discrimination in the most unexpected of places. The atmosphere in the main cabin had been charged with a quiet defiance ever since Zara Carter began her silent documentation of the injustice. Now, as the flight continued its steady journey, a palpable tension began to seep into every corner of the cabin. A tension that would soon ignite into an open clash between two distinct forces: those defending the status quo of a prejudice system, and Zara, whose dignity and resolve had already set the stage for change. Across the aisle, whispers grew louder as a few passengers who had witnessed the unfolding events in first class began to speculate on the implications of Zara's removal. Their voices, low yet urgent, carried mixed sentiments of outrage and reluctant admiration. A sharply dressed gentleman in a dark suit leaned over to his neighbor, murmuring, "Did you see that? They actually thought they could push her out like that. It's outrageous." His tone, though hushed, resonated with a sense of injustice that many felt, but few dared to voice openly. Meanwhile, the flight attendants in the main cabin were not immune to the undercurrents of tension. One of them, a mid-career attendant named Laura, who had always prided herself on professionalism, now wore a conflicted expression. She had witnessed the ordeal from afar and found herself questioning the orders that had been so brazenly executed by Emily in first class. As she moved down the aisle, she exchanged furtive glances with a colleague, silently acknowledging that something was amiss with the way the incident had been handled. At that precise moment, an unexpected jolt disrupted the simmering tension. A sharp buzz from a phone. Zara, still seated near the center of the main cabin, felt her heart skip a beat as she glanced at her device. A text message appeared from an unknown number, its contents brief but loaded with implication. "We're watching. Stay strong. The board." For a split second, time seemed to stand still. The message confirmed what Zara had long suspected. She was not alone in this battle. Her quiet resistance was backed by powerful allies, and the wheels of accountability were already in motion. A small, determined smile tugged at her lips as she acknowledged that her silent rebellion was about to become the spark for something much larger. Not long after, a hushed conversation erupted among the crew members stationed in first class. Emily, who had been diligently enforcing orders, now found herself huddled with a couple of her colleagues in a secluded corner behind the galley. Their voices were tense. "I don't understand," one attendant whispered, her eyes wide with apprehension. "The message from headquarters just came through on my phone. They're asking for a full report on today's incident." Another crew member, whose voice carried a hint of regret, replied, "If Zara is connected to the board, this isn't just about a seating mistake. It's an indication of a systemic problem." The conversation revealed cracks in the facade of unquestioned authority that Emily had tried so hard to maintain. In the midst of this internal discord, a younger attendant, who had previously admired Emily's strict adherence to protocol, now hesitated, torn between loyalty and a budding awareness of injustice. Back in the main cabin, the air felt heavy with anticipation. Zara's eyes darted from her notepad to the faces around her, reading unspoken stories in each expression. Some passengers appeared emboldened by her presence, their expressions softening into resolute support, while others wore masks of indifference that now looked increasingly contrived. A middle-aged woman seated near the window leaned toward her companion and said quietly, "I can't believe what I witnessed." That woman's composure, it's like she's already planned her comeback. Her words, laden with a mixture of hope and indignation, rippled through the cabin, adding another layer to the growing discord. Suddenly, an announcement came over the cabin intercom, breaking the murmurs with a tone of measured urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we will be making an unscheduled communication shortly. We ask for your patience." The announcement, though brief, sent a shiver down the spines of many on board. It was as if the higher echelons of the airline's management were now preparing to intervene directly, a move that promised to further polarize the already tense situation. Zara's pulse quickened as she sensed that the situation was about to escalate even further. The anonymous text, the whispered crew conversations, and now the captain's message combined into a crescendo of anticipation. She discreetly adjusted the angle of her phone to capture the ongoing dynamics, knowing that every detail might prove vital in the aftermath of this confrontation. In the next few minutes, as the cabin waited in hushed expectancy for further instructions, the clash of forces became more apparent. On one side were those entrenched in a culture of unyielding hierarchy and prejudice, a group that, despite being small in number, wielded the power of tradition and fear. On the other side was Zara, representing a new order of quiet defiance and unwavering dignity, bolstered by the assurance of support from unexpected quarters. Amid this charged atmosphere, Laura, the conflicted flight attendant, gathered her courage and stepped forward. She approached Zara with a gentle smile, her voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Carter, I just want you to know, what happened is not right. I, along with a few others, have already alerted our supervisors about the incident." The sincerity in her eyes was unmistakable, and for a moment, the vast gulf between the two sides seemed to narrow. Zara nodded in gratitude, her expression softening as she realized that not everyone in the system was complicit in perpetuating injustice. Just then, another unexpected turn of events occurred. A discreet, high-priority call came through to the captain's office, and his tone, when he spoke over the intercom again, was laced with an urgency that left little room for ambiguity. "Attention, all crew members. Please be advised that a direct inquiry is being launched regarding the seating arrangements and the treatment of passengers on this flight. We expect full cooperation from everyone involved." The message, clearly issued from the upper management, reverberated throughout the cabin, sealing the fate of those who had been orchestrating the discrimination. Emily, who had been watching the unfolding events with a mixture of apprehension and stubborn resolve, felt the walls closing in on her. The authority she had wielded so confidently now appeared fragile and exposed. Her eyes flickered as she exchanged a last, troubled glance with one of her more experienced colleagues, a silent acknowledgement that the system was now turning its scrutiny on her actions. In that critical juncture, the conflict aboard the flight crystallized into two irreconcilable stances. Zara, with her meticulously documented evidence and the backing of a powerful network, stood as the embodiment of resistance against an outdated and prejudiced order. On the opposite side, Emily and her cohorts, clinging desperately to their perceived authority, faced the dawning realization that their actions would not go unchallenged. As the flight continued on its path across the sky, the charged silence of the cabin was intermittently broken by the soft tapping of fingers on phones, the scribbling of notes, and hushed exchanges of supportive words. Each small act of defiance, each murmured expression of solidarity, served as a counterpoint to the overt displays of authority that had attempted to subdue Zara earlier. The air, heavy with the promise of change, seemed to vibrate with the collective energy of those unwilling to accept injustice. In this unfolding drama, it became increasingly clear that the battle was not merely a personal struggle for Zara Carter. It was a microcosm of a larger societal conflict. The clash between the entrenched forces of discrimination and the emerging voices of accountability was playing out at 30,000 feet above the ground, in a space where every glance, every whispered word, carried the weight of history and the hope for a more equitable future. Zara's steady gaze never wavered as she continued to record and document, fully aware that this incident was about to transcend the confines of the aircraft. It was a turning point, a moment when a single act of dignified resistance could ripple outwards, challenging deep-seated prejudices and paving the way for systemic change. The flight, once a symbol of opulence and order, had transformed into a battleground where the forces of tradition and progress were set to collide in a confrontation that promised to leave lasting repercussions for all involved. And so, with every passing minute, the tension grew, the conflict deepened, and the promise of retribution and transformation hung in the air like a tangible force. The stage was set for the next act of this high-altitude drama, a showdown that would not only redefine the dynamics on board, but also send a clear message. that no matter how high one flies, the fight for dignity and justice is a journey that demands courage, resilience, and unwavering determination. Just as the simmering tension in the cabin reached a fever pitch, a series of unexpected announcements and swift actions began to shatter the status quo. The quiet rebellion that had taken root in the main cabin, led by Zara Carter's unwavering dignity and meticulous documentation, was about to encounter a force far larger than the individual biases of one flight attendant. At precisely that moment, the captain's voice rang out over the intercom once more, this time with a gravity that silenced every murmur. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Harris. I must inform you that due to a serious concern regarding the treatment of passengers on today's flight, we are initiating an immediate internal review. All crew members are required to cooperate fully with the forthcoming inquiry. The announcement sent a ripple of shock and apprehension throughout the aircraft. For many passengers, it was a jolt into reality, a signal that what had begun as a personal affront was now being recognized as a systemic failure. Within seconds, the cabin transformed from a space of muted tension to a battleground of accountability. Zara felt her pulse quicken, not from fear but from a surge of vindication. The captain's words confirmed what she had long suspected, that her quiet resistance had reached ears far beyond the confines of the main cabin. Her phone buzzed again, a new message from the board that read, "Proceed with evidence. We have initiated an inquiry." The note was brief, yet it carried the weight of institutional support, making her resolve even firmer. Meanwhile, in the first-class section, the atmosphere was no less dramatic. Emily, whose earlier confidence had begun to crumble under the mounting pressure, found herself surrounded by her colleagues. Hushed conversations filled the narrow space behind the galley. One senior attendant, his voice tinged with regret, murmured, "The higher-ups are now involved. They're demanding a full report. This isn't just about one passenger, it's about our entire approach." The gravity of the situation was sinking in. For Emily, every whispered word, every concerned glance from her peers, was a reminder that the system she had relied on was turning against her. As the inquiry took shape, several key players emerged. Laura, the compassionate flight attendant who had earlier offered Zara a word of support, now stood a little taller. With a trembling hand, she approached a senior crew member and insisted, "We need to document everything. I saw how Ms. Carter was treated. It's not just a miscommunication. It's discrimination. We have to report it." Her words, delivered in a voice that quavered with both fear and determination, resonated with the others. Soon, a few more attendants began discreetly gathering statements and confirming that similar incidents, however isolated they might have seemed before, were part of a broader pattern. In the main cabin, Zara continued her quiet work. Between glances at her notepad and the steady tapping on her phone, she captured every detail: the tone of Emily's voice, the shocked expressions of nearby passengers, and even the subtle shift in the demeanor of the cabin crew. A sympathetic passenger seated near her, an older woman with kind eyes, leaned in and whispered, "I've never seen anything like this on a flight. You're incredibly brave." Zara managed a small, grateful smile, her eyes glistening with resolve. Every piece of evidence she collected was now more than just a record of humiliation. It was a brick in the foundation of accountability. Then came the next dramatic twist: a live broadcast from the airline's headquarters, which unexpectedly flickered onto the cabin's entertainment screens. The familiar logo of Aurora Sky Airlines glowed ominously as a senior executive, his expression solemn, addressed the entire flight. "We are aware of an incident involving the treatment of a first-class passenger," he announced. "Effective immediately, a full and independent investigation is underway. We have zero tolerance for discrimination in any form. All findings will be made public, and appropriate action will be taken." His voice, measured yet authoritative, reverberated through the cabin, leaving no doubt that the airline was taking this matter very seriously. The reaction was immediate and electrifying. In first class, the smug assurance that had once colored the space gave way to a tense uncertainty. Emily's face, once set in a mask of indifference, now flushed with a mix of fear and realization. Her colleagues exchanged uneasy looks, silently acknowledging that their chain of command was about to hold them accountable. In the main cabin, Zara felt a surge of vindication. The public airing of the airline's commitment to transparency not only validated her own experience, but also empowered others to confront injustices they might have witnessed in silence. Over the next several minutes, the cabin buzzed with a mix of relief, apprehension, and even anger. Some passengers, emboldened by the executive's message, began to murmur among themselves about the need for reform. "This is the moment we've been waiting for," said one gentleman, his tone both defiant and hopeful. "We must stand up against this kind of bigotry." Others, however, remained stoically silent, their expressions a blend of skepticism and cautious optimism. From behind the scenes, the airline's crisis management team was already mobilizing. In a flurry of rapid-fire messages exchanged between the cabin crew and the ground staff, orders were issued to secure all recorded footage and to ensure that every crew member provided a full account of the events. The captain's earlier announcement had set in motion a process that would leave no stone unturned. The integrity of the airline, built on the promise of excellence and respect, was at stake. Emily, standing in a secluded corner of the first-class section, could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on her. Her earlier actions, driven by a narrow perspective and a prejudiced mindset, were now under the harsh light of scrutiny. The whispers of her colleagues, the stern directive from the captain, and the public broadcast from headquarters converged into a single, inescapable reality. Her career, and the very fabric of the service culture she represented, was on the brink of collapse. Back in the main cabin, as the flight continued its steady journey across the open skies, Zara's quiet defiance had transformed into a beacon of hope. Every recording, every written note in her notepad was not merely a record of a personal affront, but a testament to the power of individual courage in the face of institutional prejudice. The airline's explosive reaction had inadvertently validated her struggle. The boarding pass, the seat assignment, and even the unsolicited remarks from some passengers now served as incontrovertible evidence of a systemic failure. In that critical hour, the dynamics aboard the aircraft had irrevocably shifted. The oppressive structure that had allowed discrimination to flourish was now being challenged from within, sparked by a single act of dignified resistance. For Zara, the series of events was a turning point, a moment when the quiet, calculated defiance of one individual began to ripple outward, threatening to upend an entrenched system. The executive's broadcast and the subsequent scramble among the crew and management had made it clear. The days of unchallenged bias were numbered. As the flight neared its destination, the air was thick with anticipation. The captain's voice returned one final time, outlining the next steps. "Upon landing, all relevant evidence will be transferred to our headquarters for a comprehensive review. We thank you for your cooperation and patience during this difficult situation." His tone left no room for misinterpretation. It was a promise of accountability, a pledge that no act of discrimination would be allowed to remain unchecked. For Zara, the moment was both cathartic and bittersweet. She had endured public humiliation, yet her resolve had sparked a response that could lead to real change. The supportive glances from sympathetic passengers, the courageous words from a compassionate flight attendant, and the unmistakable intervention from the airline's top brass converged to create a powerful counter-narrative against prejudice. Even as the flight began its descent, and the cabin prepared for landing, Zara's thoughts were already turning to the future. A future where every recorded detail of this incident would serve as a catalyst for systemic reform. The explosion of the system had transformed an isolated act of discrimination into a widespread outcry for justice. As the aircraft touched down and the passengers filed off the plane, the repercussions of that turbulent flight promised to resonate far beyond the confines of the cabin. Zara Carter, with her unwavering dignity and steadfast determination, had not only stood up for herself, but had ignited a movement. A call to action that challenged the very core of discriminatory practices in one of the world's most exclusive environments. In that moment of collective reckoning, the airline's commitment to change was no longer a distant promise. It was an unfolding reality, spurred by the courage of one woman and the undeniable evidence of systemic failure. The seeds of transformation had been sown at 30,000 feet above the earth, and as the doors of the aircraft swung open, a new chapter in the fight for equality was ready to begin. In the wake of the explosive revelations announced over the intercom, the entire aircraft seemed to be gripped by an inescapable tension, and nowhere was that more palpable than in the eyes of Emily. Once so sure of her authority and convinced of the righteousness of her actions, Emily now found herself trapped in a whirlwind of doubt, regret, and inner conflict. Back in the first-class section, as the captain's directives continued to echo throughout the cabin, Emily stood frozen near the galley, her posture rigid and her mind racing. The hushed murmurs of her colleagues and the anxious glances of the senior crew felt like daggers, each one chipping away at the confident facade she had so carefully constructed. With every whispered conversation, the reality of her actions came crashing down. Her decision to forcibly relocate Zara Carter, a decision made on the shaky ground of prejudice, was now being scrutinized by not only the airline's upper management, but also by her own conscience. Inside Emily's mind, a tumultuous debate unfolded. Memories she had long buried, the subtle teachings of superiority from a rigid upbringing, the unexamined biases that had slowly seeped into her professional life, now resurfaced with brutal clarity. In the solitude of her thoughts, she began to question every assumption, every instinct that had guided her actions that fateful day. Was her authority truly built on competence, or was it simply a veneer masking a deeper, more insidious prejudice? Her internal struggle was punctuated by flashes of guilt. In the quiet recesses of her memory, Emily recalled moments when she had witnessed acts of kindness from unexpected quarters, moments when the genuine warmth of human decency had shone through, even in the most regimented environments. Now, faced with undeniable evidence that her own behavior had contributed to an injustice, she felt a deep and gnawing remorse, a feeling that was entirely foreign to the stern, unyielding persona she had maintained for so long. In a brief moment of vulnerability, Emily retreated to a corner of the cabin, her back pressed against the cool wall as she closed her eyes. The low hum of the engines, once a reassuring constant, now seemed to underscore the weight of her transgression. She tried to steady her breathing, yet the rapid rhythm of her heart betrayed her inner turmoil. Every whispered remark from nearby crew members and passengers, every sideways glance filled with disapproval, reverberated in her ears like a relentless chant of condemnation. The confrontation with the airline's crisis management team had been swift and unyielding. In a private, hurried discussion over the phone, a conversation that was filled with clipped, formal language and a tone of finality, she had been informed that a full report of the incident was being demanded. The words "zero tolerance for discrimination" echoed in her mind, mingling with the stark realization that her career and indeed her self-image were on the line. The message was clear: there was no room for personal bias in an institution that prided itself on excellence and fairness, and her actions had irreparably tarnished that image. Standing there, Emily found herself haunted by the faces of the passengers she had wronged. Zara Carter's steady, unwavering gaze and the subtle expressions of solidarity that had begun to ripple through the cabin. Each face was a mirror reflecting her own failure, a reminder that her actions had not only diminished another person's dignity, but had also exposed the frailties within herself. The inner voice that had long been silenced by the cacophony of authority now grew insistent, urging her to confront the painful truth. She had allowed her own biases to dictate her actions, and in doing so, had compromised the very principles she once believed in. A memory surfaced unbidden, an incident from her early days on the job, when a senior crew member had cautioned her about the dangers of unchecked arrogance and the importance of empathy. At the time, Emily had brushed off the warning as mere operational advice. But now, in the stark light of her current predicament, those words resonated with a haunting clarity. Had she been so blinded by her own sense of superiority that she ignored the fundamental human connection that should have defined her role? The question tormented her, each repetition deepening the chasm of regret. In a quiet moment of introspection, Emily even considered the possibility that the very system she had defended was flawed, a system that allowed for such overt displays of prejudice to occur under the guise of following protocol. The irony was bitter. The airline, a symbol of elite service and high standards, was now forced to reckon with the reality that discrimination could thrive, even in the most sophisticated environments. The internal structures she had so dutifully upheld were crumbling under the weight of their own contradictions. With the aircraft hurtling through the sky toward its destination, Emily's thoughts turned toward the future. What would become of her? Would she be able to rebuild not only her career but also her moral compass? These were questions without easy answers, and as she stood there, the gravity of the moment seemed to settle in, heavy and unyielding. The path forward was shrouded in uncertainty, a journey of introspection and perhaps redemption if she dared to confront the demons of her past. In the midst of her inner chaos, a soft knock on the door of the galley startled her. It was Laura, the compassionate flight attendant who had earlier expressed support for Zara. In that brief exchange, Laura's eyes held a mixture of pity and understanding, silently urging Emily to recognize that change was inevitable. "Emily," Laura said quietly, "sometimes it takes a moment like this to see the truth. I hope you find a way to make it right." The words were simple, yet they carried an immense weight, a call to action that demanded more than just remorse. They demanded transformation. The encounter left Emily momentarily speechless. In Laura's gentle yet unyielding tone, she heard not just criticism but also a plea for accountability and growth. It was a moment of reckoning, a chance to acknowledge her missteps and to begin the arduous process of change. The realization was both painful and liberating. To truly regain her dignity, she would have to dismantle the prejudices that had defined her for so long and rebuild herself on a foundation of empathy and respect. As the flight continued, every passing minute became a reminder of the consequences of her actions. The once unshakable authority that Emily had wielded with pride was now replaced by a profound sense of vulnerability. She could feel the weight of every judgmental stare, every whispered comment, and every internal sigh of disapproval. It was a constant, inescapable presence, a reminder that in the pursuit of power one must never lose sight of one's humanity. In the final moments before the plane began its descent, Emily took a deep, shuddering breath. Though her future was uncertain, one thing was clear. The incident aboard this flight had irrevocably changed her. The journey toward redemption, though daunting and fraught with painful self-examination, had already begun. Whether she would emerge from it as a better person remained to be seen, but for the first time, Emily allowed herself to confront the uncomfortable truth that true authority was not derived from a rigid adherence to outdated protocols, but from the courage to acknowledge one's mistakes and the strength to transform them into a force for good. As the aircraft touched down and the cabin slowly filled with the murmur of passengers disembarking, Emily remained in the galley, lost in thought. The turbulent emotions swirling within her were a testament to the complexity of the human spirit, a spirit that could, even in the depths of shame, find the spark of hope and the possibility of change. In that quiet, reflective moment, the seeds of remorse and renewal took root, promising that even amidst the fallout of her actions there might someday emerge a path to redemption, not just for herself, but for an entire system in desperate need of transformation. As the aircraft began its descent, the atmosphere within the cabin remained charged with anticipation and unresolved tension. The turbulent events that had unfolded high above the ground were now set to converge in a dramatic confrontation on the tarmac. For Zara Carter, every moment had led her to this turning point, a moment when her silent rebellion would be confronted head-on by the very forces meant to uphold the airline's standards. Once the plane touched down and came to a smooth stop at the gate, the cabin buzzed with murmurs. Passengers exchanged looks, some filled with sympathy for Zara's ordeal, others with silent, disapproving judgment towards the conduct that had precipitated the crisis. In the midst of this swirling emotion, the airline's crisis management team swiftly moved to assert control. An official-looking crew member, accompanied by a few stern-faced managers, began gathering statements and retrieving the recorded footage that Zara had so meticulously captured. Stepping off the aircraft into the chilly airport terminal, Zara felt the gravity of the moment weighing on her. A sense of determined calm radiated from her, despite the whirlwind of chaos behind her. She was quickly escorted to a private area near the terminal's security checkpoint, where a group of airline officials awaited her. Their faces were composed but unmistakably serious, a silent reminder that the coming confrontation would determine not only the fate of those involved, but also the future direction of the airline's policies. Among the officials was a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, whose measured tone carried the authority of someone used to resolving high-stakes conflicts. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice even but firm, "we have received your documented evidence and spoken with several crew members regarding the incident on board Flight AS-237. We understand that your treatment was not only a breach of protocol, but also a violation of our company's commitment to equality." Zara's eyes, steady and resolute, met his gaze as she replied quietly, "I booked my ticket as a first-class passenger weeks ago. I was denied the dignity and respect that came with it, solely based on biased assumptions. I am here because I believe this system must change." The official nodded gravely. "I agree, and rest assured a full investigation is underway. However, we need a complete account of your experience. I must ask you to detail everything that occurred from the moment you boarded to your forced relocation." His tone was inquisitive yet supportive, a stark contrast to the earlier cold indifference displayed on board. As Zara recounted the events, her encounter with Emily, the dismissive tone, the forced move, and the subtle yet undeniable signs of prejudice, her voice never wavered. Each detail was articulated with clarity, revealing not only the factual timeline, but also the emotional impact of every slight. The officials listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. Occasionally, one of them would exchange a meaningful glance with a colleague, as if acknowledging that this was a systemic issue far beyond an isolated incident. Meanwhile, a commotion began to arise behind them. A subordinate from the airline's Human Resources Department, visibly perturbed, entered the room. "We have reviewed the recorded footage and received corroborating statements from several crew members. The evidence clearly shows that the treatment you received was discriminatory," she declared, her voice tinged with urgency. "We are prepared to take disciplinary action against those responsible, and we are also initiating a review of our policies on passenger treatment." Zara felt a surge of vindication, but maintained her composure. "I appreciate your commitment to accountability. My goal here isn't to seek personal revenge. It is to ensure that no one else has to endure what I did. I trust that this incident will lead to meaningful change." At that moment, the conversation was interrupted by a stern knock on the door. Emily was ushered in, her face pale and her posture slumped as if weighed down by guilt. She hesitated at the threshold, her eyes darting nervously between Zara and the officials. The senior manager's gaze was unyielding as he addressed her. "Ms. Reynolds, please explain your actions on Flight AS-237. Why did you insist on relocating Ms. Carter, despite her valid ticket and the clear indication of her rightful status?" Emily's voice trembled as she began. I was following what I believed was protocol. I assumed there was an error, and I acted to maintain order. I never intended to—" Her voice faltered and she paused, swallowing hard. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. One of the officials interjected sharply, "Intentions aside, your actions have caused irreparable harm. Not only have you humiliated a valued passenger, but you have also betrayed the trust that our brand represents." Emily's eyes filled with regret as she realized the depth of her error. The conversation grew tense, with Emily's attempts to justify her behavior unraveling in the face of incontrovertible evidence and the collective disapproval in the room. Zara listened intently, her expression unreadable. In that charged atmosphere, the stark contrast between her quiet dignity and Emily's crumbling facade could not have been more apparent. A young attorney present as part of the airline's inquiry team summarized, "This incident is a clear example of how personal biases can undermine professional responsibilities. It's not just about one mistake, it's about a systemic failure that allowed such behavior to persist." The dialogue that ensued was raw and unfiltered. Passengers and crew members who had witnessed the incident were now speaking out, either directly or through written statements, condemning the actions that had unfolded on the flight. The exchange was not simply a regurgitation of facts, it was a confrontation of values, a clash between an outdated prejudice system and the modern demand for equality and respect. As the meeting drew to a close, the lead official assured Zara, "Your courage in coming forward has not only given us the evidence needed to hold those responsible accountable, but it has also set in motion changes that will reshape our service culture. We will be implementing comprehensive sensitivity training and revising our protocols to ensure that every passenger is treated with the respect they deserve." Zara's eyes softened ever so slightly as she acknowledged the promise of reform. "I hope that my experience will serve as a catalyst for change, not just for Aurora Sky Airlines, but for the entire industry. Discrimination in any form must end," she stated firmly. The confrontation in that sterile meeting room at the terminal was a microcosm of a much larger battle, a struggle for dignity, accountability, and systemic change. As the airline officials detailed their planned actions, including disciplinary measures against those involved in a public review of their policies, a sense of cautious optimism began to fill the room. Outside, the hum of the terminal and the steady flow of passengers departing signified that life would go on, but inside, the repercussions of that flight had already ignited a movement. The dramatic showdown between Zara, the airline's upper echelon, and Emily, once a confident enforcer of a flawed system, had transformed into a powerful statement against injustice. In that final moment, as the meeting concluded and Zara prepared to leave with her statement and evidence in hand, it was clear that this was not the end of the struggle, but rather the beginning of a new chapter. One where accountability, transparency, and respect would be the guiding principles. Principles that, if upheld, could one day eradicate the shadows of prejudice from even the most exclusive corridors of power. In the charged aftermath of the showdown on the tarmac, the airport terminal became a microcosm of a nation in transition. As Zara Carter stepped away from the formal meeting, her heart still pounded with the echoes of every painful injustice inflicted upon her. She could almost feel the weight of every discriminatory remark that had been hurled at her throughout the flight. Yet, amid the bitter taste of deep-seated racism, a fierce determination shone in her eyes, a silent promise that the struggle for dignity was far from over. The airline's announcement of sweeping reforms and disciplinary actions against those involved reverberated like an electric current through the terminal. For many, it was a moment of catharsis, a clear message that institutional racism would no longer be tolerated. For Zara, however, it was a bittersweet victory. The humiliations she endured were stark reminders of a legacy of prejudice that had marginalized Black individuals for generations. A legacy now being publicly challenged, yet still painfully present. Outside, the brisk evening air was filled with murmurs of change. Media vans and cameras quickly descended upon the scene, capturing every nuanced expression of defiance and vulnerability. Journalists prepared to broadcast the story that had shaken an entire institution, ensuring that the deep scars of racism and the bravery required to confront them would be laid bare for the world to see. Meanwhile, the disgraced Emily and her cohorts faced a reckoning that stretched beyond the confines of corporate policy. Their downfall was not merely an internal punishment, but a public indictment of a system that had, for too long, allowed discriminatory practices to flourish under the guise of protocol. In that moment, the drama was no longer confined to an airplane cabin. It had ignited a conversation across the nation about accountability, respect, and the urgent need for systemic change. Zara's measured composure, recorded evidence, and resolute testimony served as a beacon of hope, a call to action for all those who had been silenced by racial bias. Her struggle, wrought with pain and resistance, had transformed into a movement that promised to ripple through society. As she left the terminal, stepping into the cool night with a lingering sense of both sorrow and hope, Zara Carter embodied the unyielding spirit of change. The final chapter of this turbulent day had ended, but the battle for equality had only just begun. The unfolding events aboard the flight remind us that every individual, regardless of their background, carries an inherent dignity that must be honored. Practical lessons emerge from this turbulent narrative. the importance of standing up against prejudice, the necessity of listening to marginalized voices, and the transformative power of courage in the face of systemic injustice. When racism, manifested through contempt and disdain, is allowed to thrive, it not only diminishes those targeted, but also erodes the collective humanity we share. Yet, even amidst deep-seated bias, the beauty of culture and the resilience of human nature shine through. Zara Carter's dignified response and unwavering commitment to truth illustrate how cultural heritage and personal strength can serve as beacons of hope, inspiring change and fostering understanding. Her actions teach us that compassion, empathy, and respect are not mere ideals but essential values that can bridge divides and heal wounds. In recognizing and challenging the biases embedded in our institutions, we embrace the richness of diverse experiences and perspectives, transforming individual acts of resistance into a broader movement for social justice. Ultimately, this narrative is a call to action, to question long-held prejudices, to celebrate cultural differences, and to recognize that every person deserves to be seen, heard, and valued. It reminds us that while racism may cast a long shadow, the light of compassion and understanding can create a future where diversity is celebrated and every life is cherished.